all sides fancy.
All right. Welcome to episode 12 of the Without Equal podcast. I'm your host, Rob McQueen. I'm joined by my co-host and co-founder of Cinepare, Steve Cargill. So Chris was unable to make it today. So what we're going to do is kind of at this midpoint in this Ukrainian special we've been running in between the interviews we have lined up and a few that are still on the editing room floor. Steve and I kind of want to talk about what we both see as the way out. So we have all of these actions happening. We have sanctions, we have rhetoric, we have the U.S. Senate voting to condemn Putin as a war criminal. But what does this really mean, and what is this into, and what are the potential outs in this conflict? So Steve and I are going to go back and forth, play a little bit of devil's advocate, and just kind of lay our aspect and our thought process into what we think is going to happen next. So Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you, man. Let's kind of take this from a just theoretical standpoint. So give us a quick rundown of where we're at, and then give us a thought process and what the hell do you think happens next?
So it's drawn out quite a bit longer than anyone really anticipated. The Ukrainian forces and partisans and everyone who's helping out have enabled the Ukrainian government to hold out to, what is this, 21 days?
I think 21 days.
So this has really drained the resources and really strained the ability of the Russian military to, clench victory like they thought they would in 3 to 4 days. So things are turning out quite a bit different than was originally intended. There's some theorists out there, some analysts that believe that Russia is on the cusp of culmination, which is to say that they run out of material to continue to be able to prosecute the war. With that, what are they able to do at that point? They've kind of petered out if that happens. So you have to figure out how to save face, essentially, because right now Putin, he's got a lot at stake trying to overtake Ukraine, trying to suppress Ukraine, trying to achieve some sort of victory. And so when you don't have the means to do that, how do you manage to create something from what could be nothing? And so, Rob, I think that you had a good point before that. In order to save face, maybe he holds something hostage, so to speak. Of course, the Russian forces have taken several mayors of cities hostage, but we're not talking about that. Perhaps holding the country hostage, not by capturing the entire country, because they don't have the means. They haven't demonstrated the means or the capability to do that. But we've seen in the news talks of nuclear power plants. And so with that, taking control of a nuclear power plant and putting it at risk is a huge problem. Yeah. And that involves so much more than just the Ukraine, than just Russia. That involves all of Europe, that involves the United States, that involves the world, because nuclear issues, they're a big hot button topic, and it could involve death of many people,
millions,
thousands, millions,
right, millions.
Yeah.
I think to hit what you just said there is I think Kim said this pretty well when we did our interview with Kim Metcalf, is the world is held hostage by the threat of nuclear war, right? I think that is the nuclear deterrent thought process is basically hey, Putin has made it very clear, if this escalates, I will use nuclear weapons because I won't have any other option. I will be limited in my ability to respond against NATO. I think we've seen in the performance of the Russian military, both in their perceived capability and what's actually happened on the ground, that there is absolutely no chance of a conventional war against Russia, because he will be forced to immediately shift to the nuclear option in order to prevent himself from being overrun. So I'm with you, man. We are a world held hostage by that threat. And I kind of want to, I don't want to cut you off and move into that, but I want to go down that line, because that's the threat. And that I almost wonder if kind of our response is either ignoring or believing that the only thing that will trigger that response would be a conventional movement, right? Like interaction between NATO troops and Russia troops, like a NATO escalation. I don't know if that's the case, looking at everything else we're doing against Russia.
That's a good question. you don't know what's going on in the mind of Vladimir Putin right now. You don't know what's going to be the red line in the sand for him to be provoked to hit the button or to decide to use tactical nukes or hold a nuclear power plant hostage. And so, it's funny when you say holding hostage, what do you think? You think of elements that are tier one elements going in to eliminate the threat and save all the hostages. Who's the threat here that we could eliminate in order to prevent that? That's a question that needs to be explored further. But it's just a very nebulous thing that we need to deal with here. That and it's unfortunate. It seems that the idea of mutually assured destruction doesn't really take hold any longer. It doesn't apply. And you've got one side that's not afraid to use nukes, it seems, to go down that route in Russia and Vladimir Putin. And then you have the rest of the world that wants to prevent it. So it's not mutually assured. It's one side is definitely appears to be willing to move down that road if provoked. So what is it that's going to provoke that measure? And we don't know exactly where that line is in the sand.
No, I think that's a good point. Let's talk about that too. So let's look at what we're doing right now. And so before this kicked off, I think when we were all talking about it, I was talking to a friend of mine, a military officer, very smart man, very experienced, but definitely sits on the opposite side of the political spectrum of me, which shouldn't make a difference when you're taking a look at something from a military perspective. But I think everyone's, kind of implicit and implicit biases against, on their political thought process kind of does have an impact when you look at geopolitical strategy in play. And so both he and I were talking about this. And as I looked at our kind of aggressive stance with sanctions that weren't really geared towards deterrence, because sanctions very rarely work as deterrence to an action. But looking at kind of our response to it, I wondered, one, he was absolutely correct in like the capability of the Ukrainians. I was wrong. I think I was kind of in the mindset that this was, if Russia had moved in a full-scale all-out conflict, it would be over quickly, right? I kind of had that thought process. I was completely wrong. He nailed that. But when I went back to him, I was like, hey, okay, so we see the Ukrainians very, very effective against the larger force. I mean, it's a tough battle. They're fighting hard. There's a lot of losses, both civilian and militarily, but they're doing a lot of damage and have shown some holes in this kind of the Russian capability. But the other side of this is like, okay, so we have Ukraine fighting at least to a stalemate or a quagmire, as Scott Miller had said. But now we have this increase in Russian sanctions. We have Germany and the rest of the EU jumping on board. We have this all-out war on the Russian oligarchs, like seizing yachts and personal aspect. Now we have counter sanctions coming back against the president and Hunter Biden from Russia. So we have this definite escalation in financial warfare that is really targeting the Russian people, right? Like that is hands down. I mean, Russia is very close to default. I think they're within like 48 hours for default right now. Like it's very close. And so we have this massive impact on Russia as a whole. But I asked him, I was like, what do you see as the out? Like, are we giving Putin an out? Because all I see is this consistent escalation of attack against Putin. And I don't disagree with what's being said. Like, I mean, the U.S. Senate voting and calling him a war criminal. Again, like we are not giving him an out to save face. So I asked the question is like, everybody's going through like, hey, here's our direct assault on Russia. This is everything we can do short of warfare. But I don't know that anybody is looking at Vladimir Putin and being like, hey, we have to get this guy to back off. And I don't know. And Rush, or Steve, you have a much better understanding of Russia than I do. But I really want to kind of get to that thought process. Like, are they assessing Vladimir Putin as going to give in to this pressure because it's damaging his country, or are they misassessing him? Because I don't see the out. And that's my fear in this entire thing. Is everything we're doing, I feel, is pushing the bear into a corner and not giving him a door to get out of it and stop this entire conflict and stop the bloodshed.
No, I totally agree with the idea that there is no out that's been given. There's no ultimatum that has been given. There's just been constant pressure. And so there's no means for Vladimir Putin to save face in what's going on here. And so with that, I think it's kind of implied with the actions, though I don't think too many will say it, that, regime change is probably how everybody would like this to play out and, continue to put maximum pressure on the economy, let there foment from the inside a revolution. I don't want to say it, but have some sort of uprising, because it needs to be homegrown. It can't be from the outside. It needs to be internal. And the Russian people, it seems that the idea is that they should develop a sense of self and be able to protect the country. That seems to be the implied message, but tough to say. Can't speak for heads of state, can't speak for anybody, but just a quick assessment seems that is the implied message out there. And so, and it doesn't need to be anything lethal. It just conditions forcing Vladimir to step aside and allowing the natural process of government to take place, because right now, things that Vladimir Putin are saying, like the idea that right now there needs to be a self-purification of the nation and that he needs to root out all traitors. To me, there's no traitors in Russia. There's people that are against his actions, essentially. And so by saying that these people are traitors, he's portraying himself as the nation. He is synonymous with Russia. And I totally disagree with that.
But I think we both agree that he believes that. So I think it's irrelevant, because I agree with you. I think the Russian people are caught in between a rock and a hard place, man. I mean, they're stuck between Vladimir Putin and the absolute control he has over their life. And I got to give a lot of props to all the RT anchors and spokespeople that are finally stepping up and showing a lot of bravery and courage. And it may seem like, holding up an anti-war thing on the news may seem kind of cheesy here, as we see that at every college sports game, right? But doing it in Russia as a major RT anchor is actually a huge deal and taking a huge risk, because you don't have the right to do that in Putin's Russia. You do not at all. And so it's tough. And to hit on what you said about regime change, because I think you're right. I think that's the idea that everyone's looking for, is that kind of maybe somebody inside his inner circle or somebody inside the security apparatus will feel the pressure, see the end of this thing, and be like, there's no other way out except to remove him. And I'm sure he feels that too. That's probably why he's locked up, the heads of his intelligence agency, the heads, all of his generals. Like, it's not, I'm pretty sure that's not just as filling a scapegoat, but probably removing some of the people that may be able to lead that regime change against him. But a regime change in the number 3 nuclear power in the world is obscenely dangerous. Like, obscenely dangerous.
And so, it seems like the West always gets caught in this loop of wanting to re-engage and restart the relationship with Russia. And I feel that would eventually be, the direction that comes back around, that the West will want to re-engage with Russia. But I think it's been identified that Vladimir Putin has just gone beyond the point of no return at this point, and that they can't really do that with him, because I've tried before back, beginning of President Obama's administration trying to re-engage with Russia. That didn't turn out. And then there's been continuous, outreach, and it just hasn't panned out. So I think that the West has finally figured that out. But before they can return to that, constant cycle of trying to reincorporate Russia, trying to re-engage Russia, they have to figure out this obstacle in Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, because I do think that is, I completely agree. And I think that's something that's come from this. It probably should have come from this earlier, is you cannot re-engage Putin's Russia. Like, it has to be Russia without Putin to really re-engage with the West and be on equal footing. But again, like, we don't know what comes after Vladimir Putin. And that is that piece of regime change that I think, if we've learned anything in the United States over the past 80 years, we should probably look at the successful regime changes that we've either executed or been a part of as the United States. And I see if I can count any, you know what I mean? Like, that's a tough one.
Right.
That's because it's complicated. It looks great on paper. Like, I think it always looks great on paper. And I can see the briefings at the very high level of, like, this is what's going to happen. Here's who's going to come in. Here's how we're going to get there. It's going to be great. It's not, it's never that way in execution.
That's why, if anything, it needs to be natural. It needs to be organic from within Russia. But that would require not thousands, but millions of people in the streets. And I think it's been identified as people are now in positions of power in the West calling outright on, the news, TV, Russia, a war criminal. With that, that signals to me that these people are no longer willing to deal with this individual, that he's no longer capable of being dealt with on equal footing, and that he needs to be put before.
No, and I think that's an indication from the West too, that basically telling the Russian people, like, there is no more engagement with the West with Vladimir Putin, right? Like, it is that message. Like, I understand the messaging that's going with this. I understand that piece going forward, but I think there is, just like I think there was an underestimation to believe that Putin would go after all of Ukraine. In my own thought process, I thought he would just identify the two areas as Russian separatist, move in and support and isolate those, claim those, and do like consistent hybrid warfare. We've talked about this over and over again. He will just chip away at that piece, but instead it went completely the other direction, and he went full go into a full military campaign against Ukraine, and that blew me away. And I'm worried that, again, we come back to that thought process that we're setting everything up. We're applying pressure. Like, we are trying to, in my mind, trying to instigate that internal regime change, right? And that external pressure, trying to drive that change, the messaging saying, we will not forgive Vladimir Putin. You better not forgive Vladimir Putin. And unless he's gone, Russia will be pretty much go back 100 years in economic and just the status of the country. So but again, I feel like we're backing a goddamn bear into a corner. I mean, we're backing somebody who's been, a KGB operative, very successful, and then has successfully taken over and held the political system of Russia hostage for better than 30 years at this point. So
right.
I just feel like we're underestimating his willingness to just not give up that power and use every single thing at his disposal to kind of go with the thought process of, if I don't have it, nobody can.
Yeah, and that's definitely. And so being in power that long, power has definitely corrupted him, and he's lost his humanity, I would say. And to be a leader, you have to have humanity. You have to have empathy. You need to be able to understand your constituents, the people around you. And I think he's lost that ability to really trust in others and work for others. And so I think that some of his inner circle have probably identified the same of what we've just discussed in terms of like what the intent of the West is, what is implied by the actions of the West in not providing that out. And, likely some of those house arrests, some of those firings, some of those, his lashing out against his inner circle is a result of that. Him not wanting to believe, him not wanting to, just listen to these people who he now is, classifying as traitors.
Yeah. And again, it's that thing is, you and I have the discussion all the time is how many times does history have to repeat itself before we learn the damn lesson? And so I don't think we've seen anything in Putin's behavior that does not fit with everything he's done consistently over the past, and just like kind of the history of Russian foreign policy. Like, it's very consistent.
It's
predictable, right? So I don't know, man. I have a ton of people reaching out and asking me like, what's going to happen next? Like, I have a few people who are kind of close friends that have no military experience or experience in the government. And they always call me when things get a little wonky. And they're like, hey, can we go get a beer? Cause I just need to talk about it. And as I look at this, like I ask myself that question before I go into that conversation is, okay, so what do I think is going to happen? Like, how do I see this playing out? And I struggle with it, and at this point in the conversation, I don't even know if I want to like go down that rabbit hole. But I really want to go back to what Scott Miller said as his most dangerous, which I thought was really good. Is he basically said, look, the most dangerous thing that can happen out of this is that there is a resolution to this conflict that sees Putin remain in power without being basically, hamstrung. It gives him the ability to return to some sort of player in the international game. So if we can end this conflict where Putin basically goes off to the side and is a non-player anymore, then we've hit a part where, hey, this is acceptable. But if he remains a major player, has that ability to continue to leverage and, hold the world hostage, so to speak, with nuclear arms, or play his geopolitical games as he has before, coming out of this, he would be a much more emboldened, even with a military loss. Like, if he comes out of this still in position of power, still with some leverage, then that is the hands down the most dangerous course of action, because it's going to continue to go and it's going to set the tone for how China begins to look at things. So I want to hit you up on this one too. China, and I don't know if I'm jumping around, like cut me off if you want to jump in on that last comment, but I really think Putin asking China for support is an interesting turn of events in this thing. Like, what do you think about that?
Well, no country can just go it alone doing, incredibly widespread and complex military operations for a long period of time right now. It's just a drain on resources. And plus, when you've got the world against you in terms of the economic impact that's been levied against Russia, they need friends. They need capital. They're under threat of default and default several times over because they've got a lot of different bills. And so they need someone to help them out. And so China has been throwing money around in order to achieve its economic objectives for the past 2 decades, even more. And who else can you turn to other than, China? Essentially, they haven't said explicitly that they're against the actions of Russia. They've abstained from any sorts of votes in the UN and so on. And so Russia is trying all that it can in order to sway the Chinese. But it's curious that they have to go down this route because the Russians historically have seen the Chinese as an enemy. And so it winds up being one of those things where, keep your friends close, keep your enemies even closer, it seems. And so this is a kind of a double-edged sword for them to go down this road. And so is this just something that is a measure in the short term to keep them afloat? Because what could be long term for them in terms of this relationship? Could they be the ones held hostage long term because of making a deal with the devil?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and you and I both agree. While Russia is an incredible, destabilizing effort in the world right now, they're not the bully on the playground. Like, that's China.
They're not.
They're not. They're not at all.
Not.
Yeah, man. So let's kind of circle this around and let's go from a Chinese perspective, because I want to spend a little bit of time talking about China. So let's kind of set up 2 scenarios. One, let's say that all of the pressure applies a regime change, whether it's through election, whether Putin steps down, whether whatever it is, like we get the most favorable outcome that we can hope for in this. So let's say most favorable. So let's say Ukraine becomes a neutral state, which I think is probably the path that's going to go on. So Ukraine becomes a neutral state, not NATO, not aligned with Russia, but neutral. And then Putin steps down. And that's the end of it. And we're there and we go back into rebuilding. So what does China take away from that? And how does that impact their ability to manage their, more specifically, their Taiwan issue?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't really gauge how bold they're feeling right now. Certainly Russia's folly right now, their inability to close the deal is weighing on them heavily. And there's been talk that Putin's failure in being able to seize his objectives and just claim a quick victory is really interfering with the plans of China to go do the same in Taiwan, especially when it comes to worldview. And so if the Chinese view everything through an economic lens, and so they obviously see that the world has turned on Russia economically and imposed an incredible duty on them through economic practices and being able to just hit them where it hurts. And China's not 10 feet tall. They're not impervious to being targeted in the same way. And, what's their threshold? Because so often you hear about China, them worrying about the growth of their GDP and how it used to be in the high teens. Now it's, 6, 7, and they're probably lying about those numbers. The numbers are probably fudged too in order to, once again, save face, et cetera. So if economic impacts were to continue to strike that and that were to fall to 3, 2%, something like that, I think that they would realize that, it's probably not worth it, at least at the moment. It's still all the while claiming that, they're not going to drop their claim.
No, they'll never drop that claim. I don't see that ever happening. But yeah, I agree with that thought process. I think if we get a favorable outcome in this as best as we can from this scenario, and we come out the West as like the royal we, so to speak, as the West comes out on top, I think it would make China really look at the economic impact. Because the economic impact of the sanctions that we've imposed on Russia are going to have decades long impact on the global economy. And I don't think people understand that. Like, it's not a short-term impact that's going to get like, hey, all right, sanctions are off, everything's good. Like, this is going to be decade-long impact felt. Like how grandiose and how large that is going to be interesting. But this is not a short-term thing. And I don't think people understand that, which is like the impact on the U.S. economy alone is massive. And if you look at that right now, it's crazy. So yeah, I think I agree with you like across the board on that, Steve, is China will take a step back and look and probably try to figure out how to keep their country going forward. And I think people often look at China and don't realize that like 90% of that country is still a developing nation. And that is a huge, huge shift because people forget how big it is, how many people they have, like how large their population is. And also just a lack of natural resources, which I think we're in a way very lucky that China doesn't have the resources that we do, because I think they would be in a totally different place when it comes to their ability to move forward with if they had the resources that we have in hand in the U.S. So, but that resource piece also kind of lends to why China and Russia would be a very dangerous partner, because Russia does have a ton of natural resources that China would love to get their hands on. So I don't know. It's an interesting piece. All right, so let's look at right now, what do we think? Let's look at the most dangerous. So let's say somehow in the next 10 days, Putin can pull this thing out, secure it, put in his puppet government in Ukraine, and then get the rest of the world to back off. I don't think that's possible, but let's go worst case scenario. So let's say Putin does come out on top of this in one way or another. What do we think that emboldens China to do?
I would say that's a medium case scenario, because the worst case would be the nuclear.
Yeah, of course,
going
absolutely.
down there.
Yeah.
So, no, absolutely, that would embolden China. But then also to think of it in terms of some time frames here. There's going to be a Congress of the Chinese Communist Party here later in the year that's going to decide the future of their leadership, and they're going to, either vote Xi back in or make him the chairman of the party, or So there's a couple things up in the air that he may not be the number one guy come that time, and he was looking, ostensibly to come into that vote with a win over Taiwan is what's being said in the papers. So without that, how does that play into that dynamic? And does he continue to be the number one man over there? Who knows? But it's certainly it's foggy right now. It's tough because you just need to let these scenarios play out. Obviously, the West is taking a bigger and bigger role, but not a definitive role in trying to bring resolution to what we see in Ukraine at the moment.
Yeah, I think what it does is emboldens China to just kind of be more increase kind of their harassment activity, and I think it'll kind of embolden them to do a little bit more on the cyber side and potentially on the financial side, leveraging the economic warfare capability they have and leveraging the cyber warfare to really push and try to further destabilize. I think they'll take very similar to the long-term approach they took with Hong Kong. I think they'll begin to apply that very heavily to Taiwan, specifically around kind of the semiconductor industry, which drives Western economy. And I think that's probably where they would focus if that emboldened piece comes forward. Because I agree with you. I think it's too murky. And I honestly don't see China, even if Putin is very successful in this, I don't think they would take the approach to take that level of military action against Taiwan. Because I think as bad as Ukraine is, I think to launch that piece against Taiwan is to garner an even more heavy-handed and different reaction from the West, I think.
So obviously we're seeing that Russia's in a weaker state than it was 21 days ago. And so if China were worth their salt, they'd probably just take advantage of that weakened state and twist Russia's arm a bit in order to get a hold of it.
100%. I think Belt and Roads goes to Russia hardcore. And probably whatever the new version would be to secure those resources, because they're in the best case scenario to really exploit Russia's weakness in this conflict, hands down. Mm-hmm. Yeah, man. God, I don't know. All right, so let's wrap this up with let's come with your predictions. Like, let's make a prediction at this far in. We're 21 days into this conflict. What do you think is going to happen?
I would like to think that Ukraine maintains its sovereignty and that Zelensky's able to come up with some sort of compromise, but that and that he's able to move to the table for negotiations where he has leverage. And I think that if the Ukrainian forces can continue to hold out another 10, 15 days, that might become reality.
Yeah, I would like to think that as well. Just garnered based on what I've seen and what I can kind of take from the multiple chat rooms I'm in and everything that's sorting through the massive amount of information and misinformation. I think Ukraine holds on. I don't think Putin is able to take Kiev. I think they split Ukraine along the border, and I think the Ukraine or along the river that runs north-south. I can't remember the name of it. The Dnieper. Yeah, and so along that river, I think it's split. I think that the to the west becomes a neutral state. I do think they're granted access into the EU, which I don't think would affect that neutrality. But there will be no. I think the negotiation will be no ascension into NATO. So I think that's what happens. What happens with Putin after that, I think, is the question. Is he allowed to remain in power, or does the West be like, hey man, you go back to power, but until there's a change in leadership in Russia, we will not release the sanctions. I think that's where the pressure and the game will be played afterwards. And I think even do we get to that point where we have the conflict in Ukraine ends, I think we're going to be in that kind of nuclear chess game for quite some time, because Ukraine's an example of, hey, trust us, we'll take care of you, get rid of your nuclear weapons, and we'll take care of you, to show that didn't work out. So I think there's a lot of countries now, I think this is going to push another nuclear arms race, which is dangerous for everybody. So
along those lines of not engaging with Putin any longer, if he does remain in power, I'm curious the resolve of the West, simply because of the energy, and it's a drug. You've got so many of the Western nations that have the 2-3 pipelines going to them, and right now they're hurting monetarily as well, economically as well, because they're not getting all of their full economic output because they can't fuel it. And so how long can they hold out as well? So it's complicated.
How long can we in the U.S. kind of shift the green lobby and be like, hey, we need to produce energy for the world, which we absolutely can. So I think that's the question, because, and that has to be the discussion right now, is do we push the energy? Is it worth it to counter Russia and become the energy provider for Europe versus the kind of green lobby that is shutting down that level of energy production? And because we're, no matter what anybody says, we're 20 years out from an effective alternate energy source from natural gas and coal and oil. Like, we're just not there.
If we were to shut off, oil, all the fossil fuels right now, we would be lights out for 20 years before anything else were to come down the pipe.
Absolutely.
So and plus you need energy to get to bridge that gap anyway. So you can't just go.
No, and I mean, honestly, to run most of those systems too, you need semiconductors. So it's like this whole thing, like it is so much more complicated than people on both sides want to admit. And I think Elon Musk said it great, and the dude cracks me up. But like he said, even if like let's take global warming, climate change, and let's pretend that CO2 does not do anything whatsoever to it, and he goes, we're still going to run out of oil and natural gas at some point, so we still have to transition off of it. So, but with the idea too that we're in this everything is a crisis, and crisis. I mean, we teach crisis action planning at Senate Party, right? Like, there's a difference between being able to do deliberate strategy and deliberate planning versus always being in crisis mode. And if we're always in crisis mode, it does not bode well for long-term planning and societal change.
Long-term success,
well, I mean, because what we're talking about is societal change. And I hate this thought process that, like, and I'm not talking one way or the other, whether we need it or not. Like, I think we all have to agree that our society needs to adjust for the betterment of our children and our children's children. But you cannot imbue societal change that will be effective and long-term through crisis. You just can't.
Yeah.
Like, and if a major event causes that societal change, it's still on the backside of it that has to be deliberate, like societal generational change to make that happen. And we're just going down this continuous crisis after crisis after crisis after crisis. And no one is in the background, like Scott said, and I agree with him, is where are the strategic thinkers being like, okay, we have this crisis now, but here's what has to happen. Like, here's the long-term change we have to put into it. And if people don't look at these things through societal change, not just scaring somebody into compliance, then nothing's ever going to happen. And we're just going to continue down this pathway.
Agreed.
Yeah, man.
Can't go around with your hair on fire and expecting to be successful.
Yeah, like you just can't. What a conversation, man. There's so many things to go off on this, but yeah, Steve, I'll pass it off to you, man, for kind of closing comments for this middle of the, I mean, hopefully not middle, hopefully we're towards the end. We've said that every single episode we do, but this kind of halftime break for in our interviews. So final comments, man.
So I'm inspired. Yeah, I'm inspired by the actions that are taking place on the Ukrainian side and the resolve that they're demonstrating, and that Zelensky is demonstrating in particular, and being able to rally support, build coalition, and be able to fight that giant, as it were. And so I expect that they'll be able to continue to do that, at least for the immediate term. And so, to continue to support them in their efforts.
Yeah, I agree. So I hope this thing ends soon. The amount of catastrophic loss that's happening in Ukraine is heartbreaking. And if anybody's ever been into a war zone or been to the country before and then after, it's a stark reminder of what war is. And I think too many people don't understand that, and they don't understand the human cost of conflict, and they don't understand what this is. So it's great to put the flags up on social media. It's great to champion it and scream death to Putin, and Putin is a war criminal, and go down these lines. But we always have to understand that the real goal here is to end the conflict in Ukraine and stop the human suffering and get back to the long process of rebuilding some semblance of normal life for all of these millions of people that have been displaced and whose homes have been destroyed. And I think that's the most important thing to keep at the center of your thoughts on this whole thing, is try to stay out of the propaganda piece and just understand what's at risk here. And it's a heavy, heavy burden. Thank you so much for joining in to this kind of middle episode here with Steve and I. It's great talking about it. This is going to be on the forefront of our conversation until we start to see some resolution. We have some more interviews coming up in the next week or so. Some are recorded and a few more on the deck. So please continue to join in and listen to the conversation. Remember to like and subscribe on where all your podcasts are listened to: Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, and also our YouTube channel. So thank you very much, and cheers.